In this video series, we'll delve into the biblical timeline of history. We aim to uncover the significance of important historical dates, such as the creation in 11,013 BC, the flood in 4990 BC, and even the date when God would bring judgment upon the house of God, the churches, as mentioned in 1 Peter 4:17. We'll also explore the date of Judgment Day, which is also alluded to in the same verse. And you might be wondering what the biblical timeline of history is and why it's important to learn. These dates weren't placed in the Bible arbitrarily. They serve a purpose beyond mere knowledge. God always has a reason for concealing truths within the Bible. These essential dates are not explicitly stated in verses, but require meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about.
All right, guys, welcome back, everyone, to another timeline episode. Got Brian here. And today's episode is episode 31. And we're just going to go over some time paths for this episode. And these time paths land on significant dates. And then we'll try to continue with Christ's life next Sunday, getting into like 29 AD and 33 AD. And then once, I know we've kind of been saying that for a while, but it's been just taking some time. And then once we get through that, we will try to work on going through 1994, 2011, and also like and then we'll get to 2033, even though we're kind of already touching upon those dates. Okay. So we'll get started. All right. If you are new to the program, you want to go to ebiblefellowship.org. And again, I just want to remind people, Brian, you can hear me right?
I can hear you.
Okay. I just want to remind people, if you want to see what programs are available or just any announcements in general, if you go to the website and click announcements, you're going to see the information here. It's not always posted right away, so just kind of be on the lookout for it. And then also you're going to see like the time for the open forum. This it's been changing recently, so if you come to the website, you can look for up-to-date information. I just updated the Sunday Q&A time slot, and also posted the information about Twitter tonight. So you can download the Twitter app if you don't have it, and you can just click this link to go to the Twitter app. But besides that announcement, we'll just go right into the timeline. So again, timeline's here. You can also find it on the right-hand side if you click Bible timeline. Now, something I just wanted to go over real fast.
Oh, before you do that, there is another timeline page for the King's timeline too. You just want to show them how to get to that as well.
Yeah, and that I'm going to make more accessible eventually. I haven't done it yet. Kind of wanted to complete the timeline, but I probably should do that. So to get to the timeline, the King's timeline, you just click this, click for King's timeline. If you click this, it'll expand all of the information. However, it doesn't show in detail the overlapping of the kings. So it does give dates, and we'll use this for time paths because there are important time paths with the kings. So if you go to the Kings, you'll see here. So the URL is ebiblefellowship.org/Kings Timeline 2. Probably going to get rid of that 2. So it's just going to be Kings Timeline. And then for the biblical timeline, it's the same domain. You could do /biblical timeline. So that's pretty easy to remember. Okay, we've kind of used a few different terms for um, like time paths and how to the numbering system, like how we count. If you go back to the King's timeline, there's like three different names: accession, non-inclusive, actual years. And then you have the non-accession system, you have inclusive, and you have calendar years. So just to kind of simplify it, we're going to stick with what eBible Fellowship has been using because there's three different names and they pretty much all mean the same thing for each one. They do mean the same thing. Except for the Kings, we're going to stick to the accession versus the non-accession system. However, inclusive and actual versus non-inclusive in calendar years. Sorry, inclusive in calendar years and non-inclusive in actual years. We're just going to lump into one term. So if you go here, there's official terms. So actual years. An actual year is simply starting the count the following year, not including the year you are on. So for example, Judgment Day began in the year 2011. However, the calculator begins the count with the year 2012. That being the first full year of Judgment Day, that gives you 22 years until 2033. Now, calendar years. A calendar year is including the year you are currently on in the count. So example, instead of skipping 2011 in the count and starting with 2012, you include 2011 as the first year of judgment. So include means inclusive. And that's why you've heard that term inclusive before. So we've seen this method of count used with the kings, the accession versus the non-accession system. There were about 7 months of Judgment Day in the year 2011, so we can count this year. So if we're going to use calendar years, we would count the year 2011 as the first year of Judgment Day. If we were going to use actual years, we would count 2012 as the first year. And just to kind of, I'll give an example of that in just a second, but both methods are biblical ways to count. It's just a matter of seeing which one God uses for the various time paths. So you'll notice with some time paths, it's sometimes calendar years and sometimes you have to use actual years. So it's just a way that God changes it up. And I don't know why it's done specifically for certain ones. We just know that it is. So for 2011, if we go 22 years, we land on 2033. So what the calculator is doing is it's not counting 2011 as the first year. It's starting with 2012. So this is what we are calling actual years. It's regular math, right? Now, calendar years is when you include this number in the count, the year 2011. And that's biblical because technically there are 7 months of judgment. So why skip those 7 months and not include it in the count? So essentially you can round off those 7 months to a whole year and you end up with 23 years. So that's why you hear Chris say 22 years, but 23 years, 23 calendar years. So that's that. So with that, I wanted to first go over that before getting into the time paths. So anything else that you wanted to add to that, Brian?
I could just show one quick visual if I could share my screen real quick.
Okay, sure.
All right. You guys see the spreadsheet here with the red and the yellow?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right. So here, let's say you have a kid that starts high school in September of 2000. So their ninth grade year would go from September of 2000 to June of 2001. Their 10th grade year would go from September of 2001 to June of 2002. And so they did 4 actual years, 9, 10, 11, 12, but they did 5 calendar years. They started in September of 2000, 2001, 2, 3, and then they graduated in June of 2004. So it would be 5 calendar years, 4 actual years.
Yeah.
Does that kind of help or?
Yeah, it's saying the same thing in just a different way. Sure.
Okay.
All right, thanks for sharing that. Okay. All right, so you'll notice last time we went over some pretty interesting time paths. So we're going to go back to just to show you what we went over. So with Abraham, we saw that Brian, you weren't here last Sunday, But we saw that with his lifespan, the 175 takes you all the way to 2033. But also, God gives us these other numbers, like when he's 100, when he's 75 years old. And we've shown that God doesn't just give us these numbers at random, they also actually take us to 2033 as well. So it's another way of breaking down the 4,200 years. So there's 4,200 years from Abraham's birth until 2033. And you can break it down by 175. So that's Abraham's lifespan. You can break it down by 100. That's when Isaac was born. And then you can break it down by 75. And that's when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, which is known as Babylon, to go to Canaan, which is known as the Promised Land. And so I believe the reason why God is showing this is because each of these time paths are actually teaching a spiritual truth, right? So, like for example, with the 75, when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, Babylon, to Canaan, the Promised Land. And so you can see that here, we can see that spiritual portrait in view of Abraham leaving, the elect leaving the world, also known as Babylon, to go to the Promised Land. And where is the Promised Land? That ends up in 2033. So this time path would be a proof for 2033 and also show that spiritual portrait. However, 175 also takes you there. It's another way of mathematically getting there. And I don't know what the spiritual significance of this, other than the fact that Abraham, can represent God the Father, but also the elect coming out of the world. So, but as far as the 100, we can kind of see, we know like 100 is the number for completeness. Isaac is the promised seed. He's born at age 100, so there could be a connection there. And there's also exactly 42 100s. So we know there's 42 generations, and there's exactly 4,200 segments of 100 that gets you to 2033. So you can see how it all ends on 2033, and they nicely fit into the 4,200 years. And also the 40 years. So we don't hear about Abraham being age 40, but we've noticed you can also start here with Abraham's birth, and 4,200 is also made up of all 40s. And we know the 40 is the number for testing. 40 is probably becoming the most popular number in the Bible or on this timeline series, but it seems like it's probably one of the most popular numbers in the Bible, maybe besides the number 3. So yeah, so the 40 years, and I think the way we would view this time path spiritually would be God's testing program for mankind. So it began with Abraham, and we saw in his life how he was greatly tested in many ways, starting with leaving the land of Canaan. I'm sure that was a big test for him. Imagine having to leave your homeland, and go into a strange land. But you also have the 40-year period. So the elect also have been going through a period of testing, but also all of mankind, essentially. And so when you get to that last 40, that's from 1994 to 2033. And we're going to see this with other patriarchs. A lot of other patriarchs have this, what I'm calling the final 40. It's that last period of testing. All right. So if you want more information on that, watch the previous episode that we went over. Okay. And then moving on, I believe we talked about Jacob, but there's some things that we hadn't talked about, some other time paths. So we're going to go over him. All right. And if you zoom out here, you can see how amazing this timeline's starting to kind of come together with all these numbers. It's a lot of numbers, but we see how detailed it is. So when Jacob turned 100, we know Jacob was 100 years old when he left Laban. So that's when he was 60 years old when he entered. He worked 40 years and he left at age 100. So if we open this up, we can see that. So he's born 2007, 60 years later. He works for Laban. And that's when he flees his brother Esau, by the way. And he works for 40 years. So 7 plus 7 plus 20 plus 6 is 40. So by the time you get right here, he's 100 years old. Now, what happened when he was 100 years old? Let's take a look. So Jacob is 100 years old. That's 1907. Joseph is 9 years old. God commands him to return to the land of his father. Jacob served Laban a total of 40 years. And I don't think I put it here, but Jacob had his name changed. Actually, I put it over here. It says Jacob's name changed to Israel at 100 years old. So we saw with Abraham, his name was changed from Abram to Abraham, and also Sarah. So when somebody's name is changed in the Bible, it does mark a significant time period. So, and probably because shortly Jacob would become a whole nation, right? So 30 years later, he enters into Egypt, and that's when the nation of Israel begins to grow. And what's interesting is 1907 is 400 years before 1407, or is that 500? Let me see.
Genesis 32:28.
500 years, yeah. And what's that for?
For Jacob turning into Israel.
Okay, Genesis
32:28.
32:28, and he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and men, and hast prevailed." Yeah, so that happened when Jacob was 100.
And his name being called, that's Kerasem.
Oh, yeah.
Just for
And
the
you can see
record.
there that it was a direct mention. It wasn't a later descendant. So what we're going to do is we're going to take Jacob's time path of 100 because that was a significant period in his life. And by the way, the 1907 is exactly 500 years before the Promised Land. So that's kind of interesting. There might be a time path there. Can look into that later. But so if you take the 100 and start with Jacob's birth, so the first 100, he's born to when he's named Israel, and then you just continue that pattern. Finally, it's 100 times 40. So if you do that 40 times, you get 4,000 years, and that takes you to the date of 1994 AD, or the 13,006th year. Now keep in mind, these are actual years, and we just went over that. That means that you don't count the year that you're on, so we don't count the year Jacob's born. We follow the traditional way of counting, right? So 2007 plus 4,000 gets us to 1994. We got to add the one for no year zero, and it's exactly 4,000 years. Okay, so that's that time path. We know the number 100 is the number for completeness. And so from Jacob's birth all the way to 1994, which you know is the latter reign, is that this is what this time path takes us to. Now, there's a second way we can look at this, and that is from 2007, which is when Jacob's born, but we're going in 40-year increments. So we're really just kind of flipping this. This is 100 times 40, but you can also look at it as 40 times 100. So you have all these 40-year periods, and that's 100 times, and that also lands you in 1994. So it's just another way to look at it, and I believe that it also has to do with testing. But we're going to see something else with this 40 in just a moment. So here we can actually start from his birth again, 2007 BC, do the 40-year increments, but instead of doing 100, we're just adding one more 40. So it's 40 times 101, and we're getting not 4,000 years, we're getting 4,040. Now this is kind of interesting just looking at this number because you see 4040. So what that is, and not that that necessarily means anything, I just thought that was kind of curious. So about exactly 4,040 years from Jacob's birth, you land in 2033. So Jacob's birth, 4,000 years takes us to 1994, but you just add on one more 40, and that gets us to 2033. So we're seeing the same exact pattern with Abraham's life. Abraham also takes you to that last 40. So it's very curious, and that means that the only way for this to have worked out is God had to set up their ages to line up with this. If Jacob had been born a year after 2008, it wouldn't have worked. Could have been born 2005, it wouldn't have worked. So everything's very precise on the calendar. Okay. So that takes us there. I wanted to point out I changed the labeling on the timeline. So actual years, we just went over that, and then calendar years. So in the case of Jacob, in this 40-year period, 4,040 years, landing on this final 40, we do have to count calendar years. So that means we actually count the year Jacob was born. Whereas with these are actual years, so you don't count that year. So this just shows you the difference between doing that. Okay. And then lastly, we can look at one more way to look at this. And that is we have 40 times 100, 4,000. But this time we're not starting with Jacob's birth. We're actually starting 40 years later in 1967. Now, what happened in 1967? This is when Esau turned 40. Do you remember that verse, Brian, offhand?
Give me a second, I'll figure it out.
Okay, I'll let Brian look that up. But essentially, Esau married at 40 years old, and he married a strange wife. And so Chris did a study on this.
Genesis 26, 34, and 35.
And Esau was 40 years old when he took his wife Judith, the daughter of Beriah the Hittite, and Bashemash, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So and this which were a grief of mine unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So obviously he did something that troubled him, and that is he married a strange wife. And so at age 40, we can say he failed the test. And so going back to the timeline,
And isn't that what God brought God's judgment in the days of Noah?
right. Yep. Yeah, it's the same. You can read that if you want.
Uh,
I got it right here if you want to look on the screen.
oh, okay. Uh, Genesis 6. What verse do you want me to start in?
You can start with one.
Okay. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives, all which they chose. Now, I know some people they think the sons of God are angels or something. It's not. It's not referring to angels. Um, anyway, verse 3. And Jehovah said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, as his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented Jehovah that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And Jehovah said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both men and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Jehovah.
I did want to point out there that it says it grieved him at his heart. Well, that's the same. It says Isaac and Rebekah were grieved, I believe, from that verse we were just looking at. It says it was a grief of mind unto Isaac and Rebekah. So, just as God saw that the wickedness of man was increasing in sons of God, so those would be those who are elect, or at least those who identify with the elect. They started to look at the daughters of men. Well, in Esau's case, he began to seek after, and he was born in a saved family, and so he was somebody who was under the hearing of the true gospel, and he fails the test at 40 years old. And so we're going to look at that time path.
It
what could,
also indicates that the historical figure of Rebecca was in all likelihood saved. Like Chris has pointed out, that although Rachel often typifies the elect, the historical figure of Rachel, there's not necessarily anything to lead us to believe the historical figure of Rachel was saved. But this verse leads me to believe that the historical figure of Rebecca was probably saved.
yeah, even though she's not mentioned in Hebrews 11 like Abraham and Sarah, but she was grieved. And not to mention, she did help Jacob escape Esau. So, going back to the timeline, so what we're going to do then is we're not going to start at their birth. We're going to start 40 years into their life. So that would be 1967. So you're just adding 40 years to 2007 BC, and you're going to get 1967. And that's going to be the starting point. And if you go 40 years, all these 40s, so we're going 4,000 years, that takes you to 2033. So in other words, we're going to see the same type of pattern with the Exodus a little bit later. But just to show you, if you start here from when they're 40 and you do the same amount of time, you go exactly 4,000 years, you land on 2033 right here. However, with this other time path up here, you start from the birth right there, and that takes you to um, actually this time path here. So you're starting with Jacob's birth, and you're going through all the 40s until you finally get to 1994. So you can see if you were to like overlap this time path with this time path, the starting point would be Jacob's birth in 1994. And over here, the starting point would be when he's 40 years old to 2033. And so it's really highlighting the time from 1994 to 2033. Now we're going to see a very similar pattern a little bit later with the Exodus, which is actually a newly discovered time path, or at least um, a particular pattern was recently discovered there. Okay.
One other thing before you move on from Jacob, just one thing I was thinking about. I don't know if you consider this significance or not, but 4,000 years from Jacob's birth in 2007 BC to 1994. Of course, it can be broken down into 40s and 100s. It can also be broken down into 50 years. So it would have been 80 jubilees from Jacob's birth to 1994.
Yeah, I was actually that's yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I was actually going to get into some of that. So even though the Jubilees didn't start with until the crossing of Jordan in 1407, it does land on uh by the way, this time path does land on other dates. We have it taking you to 2033 and 1994, but for example, Jacob eventually takes you to the birth of Christ. So if you go what is that? 2000 years? Well, I'll show you that with this time path. But it does land on it's got to land on 1407, right?
Yeah.
So what is it? How many 40s is that? 2007 plus
That would be
I think 12
it'd be
40s.
600 years, so divided by 40.
Well, if you go actually what's interesting, if you go 12 40s, you get to Moses's birth. If you go 13 40s, you get to the Exodus. So 12 40s takes you to Moses's birth. It's the same time path we saw with Moses. You essentially what you're doing is you're going backwards. I don't know if you saw this last time, Brian, but we've been looking at Moses's time path. Oops, one second. Screen froze up. Okay. Oh, doesn't look like Moses's time path. Let's cooperate. So we saw with Moses's time path that it's all made of 40s, right? And the first three parts of his life are all made of 40s. Well,
Mm,
if you click this 40, it actually backtracks. So you can go farther beyond back in time. And this will, of course, land on, it lines up with all these 40s,
yeah,
It'll take you as far back as Abraham, which is right here, but it'll take you to Jacob's birth to when he's 40 years old. That's what this 40 is. Jacob and Esau's birth until they're 40 years old. So it's not like it's the same, they're caught in the same stream, so to speak, of 40s, but it just does it goes back farther. Um, so yeah, and then as far as do you have a question? I guess we could take the question real fast. Do you have a question, Bob?
Yeah, I had a question about Moses' timeline. What you were talking about last week, how um, actually the question is about Acts 13:20 and the 400 the about 450 years.
Oh yeah, right here.
Yeah, but I think that it uses Moses' timeline, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so when you were talking about that, it reminded me of in Adam when Mr. Camping used a different set of circumstances to arrive at the about 450 years. Um, do you know about that?
No, yeah, I haven't heard about it. I just know that what Chris was teaching was that the about 450, because it's talking about the space of the judges, but when you actually look at the
Yeah,
judges, the judges only expand to a 360 year period. Sorry, my mouse is acting up. There we go. Nope. I'm gonna refresh the page. So the judges period only spans a period of 360 years, and the problem is that it says 400 and about 450.
right.
That so what Chris was saying is if you actually backtracked and started with Moses when he was 40 years old,
Yeah,
you'll notice that when they thrust Moses away, they said, "Who made thee a judge?"
right,
which was indicating he was the first judge. And so if you start there from Moses all the way to Samuel, you get exactly 440.
right.
But if you add the extra 10, because it does say about 450, what's interesting is you get to David's birth, right? David, Brian, or
Yes,
is his,
correct.
so I don't know if there's any significance there, but if you actually go 450 years, it does land on a significant date. And also this time path takes you to 2033 as well.
Yeah, I think that it's probably right that we correct Mr. Camping's timeline. Uh, it sounded good when you read Adam Wen, but he starts with let me see, he starts with 1407 BC when after the Israelites take over Canaan, and
Hmm.
yeah, and then he goes all the way to Solomon, who's not a judge, and that wound up being about 400 and I think 467 years.
Oh, okay.
So that's how he came up with about 450.
I see. Okay.
I,
Yeah.
I yeah, I think the current teaching is the way to go.
Yeah.
Makes more sense. It fits better, and um, so I just wanted to point that out that maybe there's other people that are also familiar with the Adam Wen account.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I didn't know he talked about that, and I would agree because this time path also happens to land on a very significant date, which is
Yeah,
2033.
yeah.
And
It's on page 76 of Adam Wen in case anybody wants to look at it.
okay, yeah, thanks for sharing.
Sure.
Um, I think Evelyn also had a question, so I'm gonna get her, and then we'll go back.
I just want to know that the 40s that I'm looking at, I see a lot of 40s in a lot of the timelines. Are they aligned like with one another? I want to take out a ruler and kind of see if it does
Yeah,
match up.
no, they do. That's kind of that's why it's interesting. Is a lot I would say definitely here. So the 440 year period from Moses into Samuel replicated, I think, 8 times. It's all made up of 40s, right? But it's just it connects with this time path here with Moses. And also the judges period. You can see it lines up. You have all these 40-year periods. So I don't think anywhere where it's not lined up actually. Like it lines up with Abraham. If you move your mouse. So what you do is you can move your mouse like this, and if you go straight up, see how it lands right there?
Yes.
you can just scroll right up and you'll see that's the way to do it. So you'll see it lands on this 40 and then that's where it ends right there.
So you
Same
keep
thing.
your mouse still and you move your screen, right?
Yeah, exactly. You just keep the cursor there and you can kind of just like I'm scrolling down and so I can see if it lines up and it'll land exactly on the 40-year period.
So this isn't like the background isn't like an Excel sheet where you can make borders, right?
Yeah, this borders.
Yeah. So yeah, because like when you have an Excel sheet and you make borders, then you can see how things align.
Yeah, well, no, it definitely works like a border. Like it's all mathematically precise. So nothing will ever shift around or nothing's like a little bit off. It's very, very precise math. Like
No, I'm not. No, that's not what I mean.
oh, okay. Yeah, but it is like an Excel if that's what you're asking. It's it's uh
So in an Excel sheet, you can click on the whole page at the top left and then tell it to create borders, and so that it'll
No, I
it'll
don't think
create a
it's what
grid.
Bob is saying. Because what he's asking is if you go in Excel, you can take a column of cells and you can make a right border or a left border for that whole column. I don't think
oh,
that's
I
a
see. I see what you're saying. Okay.
so. I
I'm
mean, I
not
don't
as
know if that's
familiar
something you
with
can
Excel.
add or not, but that's not something that's inherent in the program.
Yeah, that's Brian's better with Excel. I don't really use Excel that often.
Okay.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's the best thing to do is just the mouse thing.
Yeah.
So, and also just yeah. So anyway, so we see how the 40s do connect with Abraham, they connect with Moses, and they connect with the Judges period. They connect with Jacob. So there's definitely a lot of connections here, which means that there's a lot of precision because Jacob had to be born at a specific date. So a lot of people may wonder, what's the purpose of the timeline and all these numbers God gave? It's not just to lay out a timeline. I mean, that's part of it, but another part is all these time paths. They have to be perfectly situated where they are in order for all this to be laid out. So it's going to be these guys. All right. So we went over Jacob. Now we're going to go to Joseph, but I actually first want to go to something else real fast. And that's the Exodus. So Chris, I think talked about this on a few Q&As ago. I don't know if it was Friday, maybe. He talked about it before the open forum started, but this relates to the entering in of the leaving the so this would be the Exodus and entering into the wilderness sojourn, which lasted 40 years. So if you click this time path, you'll notice that it's all made up of 430s that take you to this one takes you to 1994, right? And that's not surprising because it's really just part of this time path. This is the one we went over that Mr. Camping actually discovered with the 1290, starting from when Jacob enters Egypt and he goes all the way until 587 BC. That's where the 1290 takes you. That's the second point of that tribulation. And you do that 3 times and you land on 1994. So this was one of the, I think, major proofs for 1994.
So it's linking not the midpoints, but the dividing points of the three great tribulations.
Yeah, and just recently I was reading his book because I didn't understand um, why. So the first 1290 takes you from the second part of this tribulation to the second part of this tribulation. However, when you go from the second part of this tribulation, you arrive at nothing that's significant. 703 AD, we don't know what happened there, but you got to do it one more time. And that's when you arrive at 1994. And so what he was teaching, and this is something we had mentioned before, is that there's actually a 1/3, 2/3 principle here. So this would be the 1/3, right? Where it lands on a significant date to another significant date. But now you have to go 2/3. So you start here on this significant date, but you can't stop here because you got to go 2/3. So you go one more third, and that's when you land on 1994. So he related the 1/3, 2/3 principle to this. I don't know if you knew that, Brian.
Um, I did. I just didn't give it a lot of thought.
Yeah, okay.
I never associated one thirds, two thirds. I just thought, okay, you triple it and then you triple it again because three is God's purpose. So you take the 430 and you triple it to get 1290, and then you triple it again to get 38, whatever it is, 38, to get to
Yeah.
1994.
Well, I noticed with the very first 1290, it starts with a significant date and it ends with a significant date. So that would be when Jacob enters Egypt, 2 out of 7 years into the 7 year famine, and then this would be 22 years into the 70 year tribulation. So both these dates are significant, but yet it's this middle one that you don't land on a significant date. You land on 703 AD. And so that's what he was saying was the 2/3 where you skip this one because now you're going 2/3, and that's when you'll land on 1994.
And I actually did look to see if there was anything significant, like, for example, if the Protestant Reformation happened then, or the nailing of the 95 Theses, or anything like that. And I didn't see anything in secular history that we could say would have to do with the gospel or anything like that. Not that
Yeah,
I'm an expert in history, but
and also it would be even if he did find something, obviously it'd be coming from secular history, and so we couldn't really add significance to that. But
it would make it interesting, though. Like, if it was the year of the Protestant Reformation or the year that they started translating the King James Bible, or something like that. You couldn't say it definitively, but it would be something that would be interesting to note if there was something interesting that happened in that year.
sure, yeah. Okay, so from the Exodus, right? We have 8 430s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now, that's part of this time path here. You're chopping off the first 430 because this takes you from when they entered Egypt to when they left. That was the Exodus, right? So what's interesting is if you go 430 from the Exodus, you land in the year 1994, right? And so I think what this is teaching is this is when they began the 40-year wilderness sojourn. So I believe what is being taught here is that 1447 began a 40-year period, but God's linking it to 1994. And so I remember after May 21, a lot of people are like, "Oh, we crossed over the Red Sea, we left Egypt, now we have to go through the wilderness." Well, according to this time path, it appears that it's teaching that there's a different spiritual portrait in view, where entering into the wilderness actually represented 1994, because this time path takes you all the way to 1994. Now, what's interesting is you can use the same time path after you get to after you leave after they left the wilderness. So 40 years later is the entering into the promised land in 1407. So if you start there, you can also take 430 8 times, and that lands you in 2033. And so, in other words, the first time path takes you from the entering into the wilderness to 1994. And then the second time path takes you from the entering into the promised land to 2033. Do you see the connection there? It's a 40-year period. And so I think this time path is actually helping us to understand that the wilderness sojourn represents that 40-year period. And so it makes sense, right? Because 40 years wouldn't make sense if it began with 2011 and it went to 2033. That's only a 22-year period.
Yeah.
So for it to match our timeline, it makes much more sense. And that event is really highlighted in the Bible. Uh, you
It's
know,
also interesting there's eight of them because eight represents new beginning. For example, eight souls in the ark, or we're in the eighth millennial day since the flood.
yeah. Yeah, Chris actually pointed that out, the significance of the number 8. And of course, the 430 is very significant because that's how long they were in Egypt. So you're essentially taking the first 430 and they're just doing another 430 and another 430. And that fits in with the 1290 found in Daniel. Now, I'll just let's pull up that one verse. It's in Acts about the 40 years.
Um,
Some of them provoked. Let's see. Some fell wilderness. Acts. Yeah, Acts 7:36. Okay. He brought them out. After that, he showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. But there's another verse that also talks about how they provoked God for 40 during that period of time. But you can see that this wilderness sojourn was a very important time in history, and it actually represents the time period from 1994 to 2033 based off this time path. So anyway, that's interesting. But I had compared this with Jacob because if you look at Jacob, it's kind of similar. If you start from his birth, that takes you to 1994. But then 40 years later, when him and Esau turn 40 and Esau fails the test, that takes you to 2033. So it's the same type of idea, right? You're just going 40 years later and then it's landing you on 2033. Now, one last thing I wanted to point out that I forgot about Jacob is Esau fails the test at age 40. Exactly 4,000 years later, mankind fails the test on 2033. So this is a testing program God set up, and Esau represents the unsaved, where Jacob represents the saved. So you have Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And so this last period of 40 that we've been in since 1994 is going to culminate with mankind failing the test, just like Esau. And Jacob passed the test because he didn't marry a strange wife. So we could say Jacob passed, right? Even though God's not really highlighting that, he's highlighting the fact that Esau marries a strange wife at 40, right? So this time path teaches that truth. And then I just want to look at this one last one. So I'm going to zoom out here. I know it's kind of small, but you really just need to see the color there. So this yellow color is the time period from Jacob's birth all the way until Christ's death on the cross. This is exactly 2,000 years from Jacob's birth to Christ's death on the cross. So you've heard of us going 2,000 years from Christ's death on the cross into 2033. This is a very popular time path. Even theologians and people outside, in the Christian world, part of churches understand to a degree the significance of this time path. However, they don't know that Jacob was born in 2007. So you go 2,000 years from Jacob's birth all the way to Christ's death. You go 2,000 years from Christ's
No,
death.
I don't think that's right because 2007, doesn't that take you?
2007 plus 4,000. Oh, I'm sorry. You have to add
It would
the
take you
40.
to his Christmas, not to the cross.
Wait, let me see. 2007 plus 2,000. I'm sorry, that was a mistake I made.
Yeah, it would take you to Christmas, not the cross.
Yeah. Thanks for correcting that. Yeah, it's Jacob's birth to the birth of Christ. That's what I meant to put. Yeah, I didn't mean to put Christ's death. Then 40 years later, you can go from the death. So there's actually a 40-year period. So the total would be 4,040, and we went over that time path. Yeah, thanks for spotting that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's 2,000 years from Jacob's birth to the birth of Christ. Then there's a 40-year period in between, essentially, and then you're going 2,000 years from the death of Christ until the cross. I mean, until 2033. So from the cross until 2033. Yeah, thanks for catching that. Anyways, I just wanted to show the 2,000-year periods. Okay. It's not really a time path per se because you're inserting a 40-year period. I mean, it is technically because we did the 40. If you go on 40-year increments, it is. We did that over here. All right. But we're going to move on because we're running out of time. So we're going to go through Joseph real fast, and then we'll have to end it here. So if you click Joseph, zoom in here. So with Joseph, we learned that at age 17, he was sold into as a slave into Egypt. So it says in Genesis 37:2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. Now, Mr. Camping pointed out that here this verse is talking about the generations of Jacob, but why is he mentioning Joseph? You know, Joseph is not the first son and he's not the last son, but he's playing a significant role. And so Joseph's being mentioned in this verse. Joseph being 17 years old. So God's highlighting, I believe, the 17 years old. He was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now, what's interesting is if you take the 17 years from Joseph's birth until he's 17 years old, and you go, so you can go 81 times. So that's 17 times 81. That's 1,377 years. And you land on 539 BC. These would be actual years. 539 BC, if you recall, that's when Babylon fell. So if you move your mouse down, you'll see Babylon fell exactly 539 BC. So I thought that was interesting. So here we have this 17-year time path that takes us to the fall of Babylon. Now, if you continue with the 17s, you actually end up, so you go 230 times. That's 3,910 years. And you land on 1994. Now, this time, you have to go calendar years. So that means you count the year Jacob was born. So I thought that was interesting because you have 539, you have 1994. And then if you add one more 40, so instead of going one more 17. So instead of going 230 17s, now you're going 231 17s. And that lands you on 2011. So what I thought was interesting is we've known about the 17 years from 1994 to 2011. It just so happens that Joseph's 17 years actually is one of those 17s if you replicate them. So that would be that 17 years from 1994 to 2011. Again, you count calendar years. And then finally, if you start from Joseph's birth and do 232 17s, which is 3,944 years, you end up on 2029, which I thought was kind of interesting. And there's a few things here. So Joseph's time path lands you on 539 BC. We know that that spiritually pointed to the fall of Babylon. I mean, to May 21. So that was a historical event that pictures what happened in 2011. So here we have Joseph's time path taking you to 539, but it also takes you to 2011, which I thought was interesting because it appears to be linking the fall of Babylon with 2011. And then finally, adding one more 17, you have to count actual years. So starting from his birth, actual years, and you land on 2029. So I don't know what the significance of that is, but I do think that perhaps the 539 and the 2011 are being highlighted. So just thought that was
Well,
interesting.
just scroll a little bit to the left. I just want to point out one thing. Just scroll a little bit to the left. A little bit more. Yeah, right there. So 230, that's of course 10 times 30. This should be 10 times 23. And 23 is associated with the Great Tribulation. You had 23 sins listed in Romans 1. Also, there were 23 instruments played in Daniel. I think it's Daniel 3. But with Nebuchadnezzar where they played the instruments. And of course there was 23 Gregorian years of the Great Tribulation, and there was 23 evening mornings of the first part of the Great Tribulation. And if you look at 231 for the next row, that breaks down to 3 times 7 times 11. And those, of course, are all significant digits. And if you look at the 232, That breaks down to uh, 2 cubed, or 8 times 29. And 29 is a number that I've come across a lot. It seems to hold a lot of significance. I'm not going to go into it right now, but I will just mention that Christ was baptized in the year AD 29. I mean, I have a whole study on the number of 29 that I'd like to get to at some point. But the 29 does seem to have a significant number towards the end of time. And I just wanted to point that out to breakdown. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, actually. There's one last thing that because Brian brought that up, it made me think of something. So we know Christ was baptized in 29 AD. What's interesting is if you take 29 and go in 29 replications, I just thought this was pretty curious. 69 times you actually end up in the year 2030, but you can count calendar years. So you can end up in the year 2029. So essentially from 29 to the year 2029 is all made up of 29 years, 69 times. And I believe you're pretty much looking at the same pattern with 232, right? It's
Mhm.
eight. That's 29 times 8. So it's 8 increments of 29 with the 17 attached. So yeah, it's just kind of curious. What I don't know the significance of why it lands in 2029. I do find it kind of interesting how, from 1994, 17 years later, you have 2011, and essentially it's 17 years later, you have 2029. It's not exactly 17 years later because we're using calendar years here. And in this count, we're using actual years. But if you go 2011 plus 18, not 17, so 18 years because we're counting actual years, that's when you land on 2029. But that's why that 17 lands you there. So I don't know if there's a connection with 1994 and 2011 and almost 17 years from 2011 to 2029. Kind of
Yeah.
curious.
Well, let me just point out one other connection with 29. The Exodus was in 1447 BC, which is the Passover. And of course, that was fulfilled at the time of the cross in AD 33. So if you take 1447 and you add 33, okay, so that would be, now remember, because you're crossing over, that's calendar years. So if you minus one to get actual years,
Well, this not add 33, you mean
take 1447 and add 33. You have a minus 1447 because the Exodus was in 1447 BC. So to get the numbers between
oh,
them, you have to change it to a positive.
sorry, yeah.
So that's 1480. Now that because you're including now normally you would have to subtract a 1 because there's no year 0. So this would be calendar years. To make it actual years, you'd have to minus 1. So if you minus 1, you get 1479. Okay. And that breaks, so that's 1479 actual years from the Exodus to the cross. And that breaks down to 3 times 17 times 29.
Okay. Yeah,
So
the
I
number
believe,
17 and
yeah,
29.
it does deserve I actually have like an hour-long study, but that's two of the things that have come up. But I do believe that 29 is a very significant number.
Okay, well. Yeah, I didn't even know that time path. All right, well, we're gonna have to wrap up the program because the panel's gonna be on. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Sunday, God willing.